Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Good morning. Welcome to our session. Thank you for being here this morning. My name is Alan Heisterkamp, and I have been working in the Center for Violence Prevention at the University of Northern Iowa since 2011. But prior to that, spent 26, almost 27 years in secondary schools as a school administrator, school counselor, teacher, and coach, which is an area, an age group that I have spent my entire 30-plus years as a professional, the last 15 working to infuse and engage prevention strategies as it relates to sexual violence, dating abuse, all forms of gender violence, and bullying. And I was introduced to and really challenged to think about this issue in a deeper way through a friend of mine who was a domestic violence victim service advocate in my hometown, who happened to have two sons that attended the school in which I was serving as a school administrator. Her name is Judy. And Judy was very patient with me. But looking back, I can see exactly the strategy and the approach that she had with her passion of serving victims of abuse, but really wanting to be more instrumental and help us as a school leader, as a school community, be thinking about prevention more deeply. That was in 2001. And it happened on the heels of Columbine, which for a person like myself in a school setting was a pretty traumatic situation. Leading a school in Iowa and having in April of 1999, the Columbine incident occur, it might as well have happened in our backyard, because we immediately started receiving phone calls from the press, from parents, citizens about the safety of our school. Right then and there, as the news was breaking and unfolding in Columbine. So out of that tragedy and out of that horrific act of violence, there began a really increased conversation about everything about school safety, culture and climate, and that's when Judy entered the picture and started having conversations with myself and others to begin thinking about, well, what are we doing to get at some of the root causes of violence, all forms of violence and abuse, not just gun violence. And so that became the start of my journey, and where I've ended up here today to be able to spend some time with you here this morning to talk about secondary schools and our work in prevention. How do we partner together more deeply and collaborate and do all those things that we know really make a comprehensive systemic approach to prevention. And so today, we're going to talk about some of those things. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Michael Fleming.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm looking forward to the presentation, the conversations that we're going to have. My journey to this morning, prior to going into the academic world, I was a clinician, worked in a community was hired to do therapy, and then was referred to as Youth Service Bureau, and started doing prevention programming and seeing the importance of that, and recognizing that I couldn't do it on my own, and having limited resources and small staff, really started to look out of my office to be able to partner with a number of folks, one of which was the secondary schools and the school system in general, and really develop that partnership to be able to reach young people on the prevention end of things, early intervention, as well as doing clinical work. And that work eventually led me to return to Wisconsin, where I got my degree, because there was a new program that was focusing on partnerships and looking at research that has relevance for the people out in the field and being able to take the questions and issues that the field has and develop answers and partner with them. But she ended up at the University of Northern Iowa, where I was involved with some of the campus sexual violence grants for a number of years, and had the opportunity to meet Alan and learn about some of the work that we were doing on our campus was happening out in other parts of the state at the secondary schools. So I think it's been a pleasure working with Alan because he provides the community perspective, school perspective, and I can bring in the community perspective. And part of what you're going to hear today is that we really kind of navigate and work and encourage collaboration, partnership between schools, communities, and our campus population. So welcome. Look forward to the morning, spending the morning with you folks.
Before I forget, so I put this slide up in front so I wouldn't forget it at the back end. There's a film coming out on sexual violence, Audie and Daisy. Michael and I have been partners with the executive directors of this film, but also the film Private Violence, which came out a couple years ago on HBO. Follows the story of domestic violence victims through the process of litigation, prosecution. Private Violence, if you haven't seen it, it's a hard-to-watch film. Michael and I helped with some of the educational curriculum for that particular documentary. This documentary, though, again, continuing on that discussion about prevention, but what I like about Audie and Daisy is that it discusses the problem of sexual violence in the secondary school arena, which, as most of you know, it is the last frontier with regards to really looking very comprehensively at prevention programming. And I'll talk more about that later, but I didn't want to miss this opportunity to share with you this amazing resource that will be available. It's going to appear on Netflix in September, but then after that run, I know there will be copies for educators like yourselves and others to use in your work. So it's just as a brief kind of overview of these next several minutes, and thank you in advance for sticking with us. I know some of you have flights to catch, and so we understand that, but thank you for willing to be a part of this interactive discussion. Really kind of, again, talking about and sharing briefly some of the culture and climate issues of secondary schools and why it's been such a challenge for us as educators and prevention specialists to really infuse this information into curriculum or into activities, but into a sustainable, measurable sort of way in secondary schools. The model that Michael and I use, and it's on, I posted it on the website, or excuse me, on the link to the conference, so you should have access to it. But the spectrum of prevention, Jonathan Cohen's public health model with policy, collaboration, changing practices, professional education development, skills and knowledge, looking at that through that lens has helped me, number one, as a school administrator, former school administrator, get into the public health mindset, because I can guarantee you my colleagues that I went to school with, to learn, to study, and to practice being a school administrator, this was not on our radar, right? This was not a part of our process in education. It was all about curriculum, instruction, discipline, all those types of things. So this is somewhat, the public health discussion is not in the front of our minds as school administrators, but that's where we are trying to go in our world to take advantage of all the expertise that's behind the public health model. Michael's going to share with you some more deeply with this assignment, what led up to it, what we're learning from it, and where we want to go, and what will it take to get there. And so I'm really excited to hear about some of the cool things that you're doing in secondary schools to share at a later time this morning. And that's how we'll actually end our session with how we get there. What are we doing? What aren't we doing that we should be doing? And learn from each other. So thank you in advance for your participation. So I don't have to share with you ad nauseum the challenges of the culture of a secondary school environment around these issues, because bottom line, it goes back to the point where if we talk about it, then I am acknowledging there's a problem here, right? And I'm, as a school administrator, like university presidents were 10 and 15 years ago, they're not running to the front of the line to sign up for training on sexual violence either, right? At least they weren't 5 or 10 years ago. What's changed that practice has been through policy. Go back to Cohen's model, right? Policy practices being changed, some mandatory requirements. Investigations by OCR never heard either, right? And why do we have, I say to myself, why do we have to go that direction as secondary school leaders? Let's learn from our colleagues in higher ed. What should we be doing that we're not? But as you can see here, and this is just a small list, but some of the barriers that I'm sure some of you have experienced as advocates and as prevention specialists or as therapists who, are contacted by victims or contacted by families that are in distress, and they feel like where do I go? How do I get help for my daughter or my son? And the gatekeeping is a big piece, but also you think about it in high schools, we really compartmentalize all of the things that we do. We have specific places. If you're a math person, if you're a math student, this is the part of the building that you go. If you're a social studies teacher or a social studies student, this is where you go for your learning over here. So we really compartmentalize things. Where do you go if you have been the victim of sexual violence? And you don't know the school counselor, you're not sure what the resources are. As a young person, I don't even know what a sexual violence victim specialist is, let alone know how to contact that person. So again, part of our strategies, your strategies, is how do we get face-to-face? How do you get FaceTime with folks so that they can know you can know them, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenges in secondary schools, these are a few, again, scheduling, a hierarchical system. Again, we kind of focus on expertise and content. I can remember talking about some of these prevention strategies early on in my administration after having met Judy, which I mentioned to you earlier, and having a conversation with a faculty meeting of 90 teachers. The building that I served in was like 1,400 students, and that's large by Iowa standards. It's not large, I know, as other high schools across the country, but it's about 90 to 100 staff members. And I can remember Denny in the back of the room said to me, "Alan, I teach physics." So this whole discussion about social and emotional learning to some high school teachers is like really down here on the list of priorities. And I get that, I understand that, but you work with kids first. I mean, we're teaching kids, and what we know about brain research, oh my gosh, they're not finished products. Don't assume that they are finished products is the whole message there. We teach kids. And so, but the opportunities in secondary schools, tapping into that passion and that interest of some students who get this. They get this better than adults at times, right? And tapping into some advisory structures, finding that champion, all of these particular strategies that you engage in. And also, we know we can certainly leverage the activity and the education and prevention that's happening in our community colleges, our military units, and our other institutions of higher education. And we can leverage that and say to our secondary school constituents, see, this is important. And we'll talk more about that later. Michael?
So part of what we listed here, are some of the common challenges that many of you encounter in doing sexual violence prevention. Some of these are drawn from the, I don't know if you can see in the bottom, the Sexual Assault Prevention on College Campuses, a national scan that came out from CDC a few years, actually a year or so ago. So in general, doing evaluation on prevention is challenging, and we are kind of on the front end of, gathering a large body of evidence on different programs. We've got some best practice models out there, but it's a slow process, and being able to do evaluation in general, and then specifically on sexual violence prevention. Fragmentation on campuses and in the larger community. Probably all of you that work on college campuses, have experience of, all these silos happening on campuses and trying to work across one department, one college, one unit within a college and campus is prevalent everywhere in many cases. And as Alan alluded to, it can also be found in secondary schools as well. How do you get academic, and how do you get into classrooms in college settings doing prevention? How do you infuse that within the Greek system, within the student government, within the athletic department? And how do you get people cooperating and working with each other is an ongoing effort. I think in last couple of years, because of some of the things happening on the national level, some of those silos are being broken and bridges are being made, but it's still an ongoing process. There's no effective solution in a box that, there's going to be one program that is going to work for all colleges, all campus populations on that campus. And unfortunately, for many colleges and universities and other settings, we look for that one box and we look to be able to kind of check off the box. Well, we've got this on, as an example, we've got an online bystander program and boom, we're done and not looking what's the next step and what do we do beyond that and how do we build upon that and how do we in athletics or academic or in the Greek system build upon what students are coming in with or what's happening in other places. We've been on our campus, we received one of the Department of Justice grants back in 2000 to address campus sexual violence, and we've been doing work since that time, but it's only in the last year, about a year or so ago, that we had a meeting of all the people from across campus and saying, okay, well, what are you doing and what are you doing, and let's get this on the common calendars so that we're coordinating and we're knowing, and this is after a decade or so of work, so we know it's challenging. Unique needs of each campus, including historically marginalized communities. That's been an ongoing challenge of how to reach out to each of the populations within a campus and speak to their specific issues and needs, and how do we get their voices and their needs and their issues heard in a way and develop a platform that these are heard, these are addressed, and these are understood by other populations. And tying into, the first bullet, being able to measure success. And how do you, in a high school setting or a college setting, when you've got rotating populations every 4 years or so, how do you look at success, and how do you look at cultural change, and how do you evaluate that, and how can you learn that this student that came in as a freshman, when they've left as a senior, what's changed for them, and what's been that process, and what's changed within the campus setting, and how do we measure cultural changes. Now, again, last year or two, there's been some efforts that are going to help us. The campus climate surveys, is one tool to help us understand that, but we need a lot more work in this area. And then, some of the challenges in sexual violence prevention. How do we introduce and address gender in all the forms that it may represent itself? And how do we have conversations that can reach all populations and also at the same time acknowledge that a lot of the violence that's happening in our society, on our campus, has a gender nature to it. So these are some of the challenges that, all of us encounter in varying degrees and are moving forward and finding answers in at different paces. Some of the other challenges that we've faced at secondary and college level is being able to move beyond one-time presentations. And this is especially happening, in secondary schools. Or even in college, you have the panel come in to your class, or you have the outside person come into your class and do the 50-minute presentation, or you have the assembly. And we know from the research that that has some limited effectiveness and maybe increasing awareness, but in the long run, it's not the approach. It's not a comprehensive approach. It is not, effective, but oftentimes that's how we get our foot in the door. So one of the other things that we know from talking with, in our work with our partners in the sexual assault agencies and domestic violence agencies is that there's this dilemma that, okay, we want to get in the doors in secondary schools and working with them, but we also have limited resources. And on one hand, we want to be successful in having all of our schools contacting us, but then on the other hand, how do we man that and person that and have the resources to that? So often agencies have limited resources. In our state, for example, a couple years ago, we went to a regionalization so that there's like one sexual violence agency that's funded to cover a multi-county area. In our region here, our sexual violence agency covers roughly 16 counties, 16 counties. They don't have a lot of resources for prevention. They maybe have one or two preventionists, but they have 16 counties. And so how do you do that? Another challenge is, a mismatch between knowledge and skill of the preventionists. A lot of preventionists that are in agencies, they are fairly new to the field, or they have limited experience in being able to work across the levels of the spectrum of prevention. They may be great in doing presentations and engaging with young people, but the skill set needed to develop partnerships, or the skill set to advocate for policy change at the local level, at the state level, that may not be part of their skill set. Or how does an agency help develop that skill set in the limited time that they may have with their preventionists or with the staff? Because we know that us in this work are not going to get rich. And that, there are wonderful opportunities and to make a difference, but oftentimes, the longevity of working in a sexual violence agency in terms of personnel, it's limited compared to other industries or other fields. So you get this preventionist, or you get the staff person that is really honed his or her skills and is doing great work, and then because of that, there's other opportunities that open up for that person. Now you're starting over. So having that stable personnel that also can be that stable go-to person as they interact with other systems is a challenge that many agencies have. And then for those of you that are in agencies that do prevention and direct services, when you're getting the crisis calls coming in, and you've got somebody that's trained as a preventionist and as an advocate, it's kind of hard to keep that time and those funds carved out for working upstream in terms of prevention when you're getting so many calls coming through for direct services. So this isn't new information obviously for many of you, because you're in the trenches, but this is some of the kind of backdrop that we want to put out there and kind of acknowledge as we kind of go forward with today's discussion.
So in the lens of education in the social emotional learning, if school leaders were educated on this continuum of social emotional learning like they are with regards to math curriculum, science curriculum, reading, language arts, because we teach that over the course of a year. We don't just teach language arts or math to the third grade and say, good luck, that's it, the rest is on your own. No, we continue to educate in those subjects extensively. So should we be doing with the social emotional learning piece. And so what this chart demonstrates to those who work in school leadership and who are committed to creating and teaching the whole child is that there is a huge chasm and gap in programming that needs to be addressed, which is our discussion here today. In your state or in your community, maybe like ours, we have totally embraced the conversation around bullying prevention. It is not it's not a stigma to talk about it anymore. We have programs up at the wazoo. We have all kinds of activities that we engage not just our students but our adults in as well at the elementary and early middle school levels. With Title IX, Campus Save Act, with the mandates, the upper education, higher education, and military, all of those arenas now are steeped in these conversations, right, around prevention, sexual prevention, bystander, campus safety, the group, the multidisciplinary group that Michael referred to. And where bullying prevention and where sexual assault and other forms of gender-based violence prevention exist in the higher and lower grades, where those two topics converge, is where we are trying to make sense of what programming looks like. What does a systemic program look like with regards to gender violence and other forms of bullying? And it's in that grade 6 to 12 somewhere. And so when you think about why is it? You know, I mentioned a few things earlier that in secondary schools, educators who teach in high schools, they went to college, they majored in a content area with a dabbling of child psychology and instructional classes combined with that. But primarily it was content focused. So when they walk into their building, their classroom in high school, that's what they're geared to do, right? They're not thinking about necessarily the social and emotional learning piece of their youngsters in their classrooms. I think that's changing, but we're not there yet. But why else? Why else do you think, as a country, as a nation, that this particular area, this middle school, high school arena, why else do you think we have been challenged, or we are challenged to really embrace systemic prevention programming? Yes?
We constantly hear we don't want you talking to our children about sex.
Because if you talk to my kids about sex, what's implied? That they're going to have sex, right? Thank you. What else? Yes?
There's such a low value appreciation for those who work with students and young people and their value for the community as a whole in general. So I think they're really underappreciated, and also that their capabilities are that we don't think they're speaking in the same way. I just said some of them get the subject more than adults.
Right. This underappreciation piece of community partners. Thank you. Yeah.
For the most part, they're already engaging in pre-K in this sense. They're going through, the bodies are going through transition.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so they're experimenting.
Mm-hmm.
We're not seeing it. But I can remember being in pre-K and seeing kids, touching each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if nobody's there to tell them, hey, this is not appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
they're getting pleasure from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to continue.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, right here, and then right here. Go ahead.
There is isolated cultural norms.
Cultural norms.
The cultural issues from different areas.
Yep, and the isolation of those things. Yes, thank you.
There's always confidentiality issues. They're huge. Tracking students, asking students questions that are inappropriate,
Mhm.
or tracking their behavior,
Mhm.
or putting their names on anything or their demographics.
Mhm.
All of those are
Mhm.
huge issues with this age group.
Yeah, this becomes really complex, and the issues are can be fatal, and so it behooves all of us to find these ways to keep the conversation going. So part of also the work that Michael and I do in our state, in our area, is, again, to address this gap. So what are our teachers, what are our parents, what are our community partners thinking about these issues? And when we talk to teachers in secondary schools, this is like grades 6 through 12, around these issues, what would be helpful for you to know and understand as an educator? How can we as a community, or in our case, how can we as an organization that's embedded in higher education, even though my heart and my focus is through the educational lens. How can we be a resource for you, teacher, in your classroom, whether you teach math, health, physical education, what have you? And what teachers tell us is that the bottom three there, district policies, services in the community, the response, how do you respond as an educator if a student discloses to you that she or he has been assaulted? What do I do with that, right? So that's the part where you, with the expertise comes in, but they have to know who you are, right? You need to literally physically stand in front of the faculty of those districts and those schools in your community, and they need to know you on a first name basis. That helps, right? I mean, that's just one piece, but teachers want to know. And then they start to ask questions and discover that there's not a lot of stuff in policies, right? There's not a lot of stuff embedded online or I can get my hands on that talk about sexual violence, talk about the investigations of sexual violence. Bullying is there, harassment's there, but so we start to create this conversation about what's missing, what are the gaps. But the teachers, half the educators we talked to in secondary school said, I want to know more about how to respond best to a disclosure. I need to know who my service providers are, what services do they provide, how can I, if I'm in that position, how can I connect one of my students and their family to you or to services, just like we do with public health. Ask the same questions with regards to parents. So this is kind of a segue. Thanks for kind of setting me up here. One of the things that I hear sometimes from my fellow educators is, parents wouldn't go for this. Not, Alan, you don't understand my community. I go, no, I live in Iowa. I understand your community. Yeah, well, what are parents saying? Parents of youngsters who have children in the secondary schools, what kind of emphasis would they really like to see the schools help support? About 67% said that, you know what, in our state, they could see some more emphasis placed on healthy relationships, dating violence, harassment, leadership, and professional development around that. Parents are okay with this if you ask them, but going back to that idea that as a school administrator, my parents would never go for this, the board would never go for this. Really? Have you asked them? Have you asked them what they would like to see some support and help in? Because you might be shocked by their response, right? So this is a great diffuser, at least in our circles when we talk to educators. Yeah, no, I think your parents will get behind you. Let's not wait for a tragedy. Let's not wait for an assault to take place. Let's be proactive, because I think parents have your back on this. And so that's what we talk about. So to set Michael up here, Michael's going to talk to you about, again, we want more voices probing more deeply, and before we go into this next series of slides, because there's a handful of slides before we get to the next activity. So in terms of breaks, please take care of your personal needs. We're not going to take an official 5-minute break or 10-minute break, but the moving around later and the discussion, please take care of your needs at that point in time. So we wanted to know more. We wanted to know how do our secondary partners think about these issues as it relates about prevention, like you, community experts, and also our colleagues in higher ed, because Michael and I are trying to work in the intersection of those three circles. So, Michael.
So part of what we do at the Center for Violence Prevention is, as Alan alluded to, we work with our community partners, our secondary schools, and higher education. And part of what our focus has been is how do we bridge those sectors? How do we bring those people together so that they're on the same page, that they can support each other, that their work is integrated? So what we have been doing for a number of years now is we use the Mentors in Violence Prevention program as a platform for lots of the conversations that we want to have in secondary schools, colleges, and our communities. So we do a train the trainer type of program where we, a couple times a year, we will have trainings where we will invite our secondary school partners, our sexual assault, domestic violence partners, and various community partners, including law enforcement, nonprofits, parents, to come to a 2-day training on this model. And part of what we've been doing also is trying to understand, okay, how does this program help build bridges? How does it help support people so that when a sexual assault preventionist is having a conversation with the school system, they understand the model. When the model is being implemented in the school, the people in the school understand who their community partners are, who the people have their back. And it provides, one of the most important things it does is it provides a platform for conversation. Yep. Yeah, thank you, Alan. For the sake of the mic, part of what Alan shared was that we use the MVP program as a platform across all sectors. It has a rich history in origin and starting to work with the athletic community, but we work across communities. So what we've been doing is looking at, okay, is this an effective program? And when people come in the door, where's the starting point? You know, when we have university folks, when we have secondary school folks, and when we have community folks, where's the starting point, and how does the conversation flow and influence their learning? So we've been collecting data for a number of years now on the program. And what we found is that there's notable differences in beliefs and perceptions among individuals depending upon the professional role within the broader community. So we do a pre and post test in the midst of doing a longer term study. And what I put up here was more of a table of some of the results, just to kind of have you see some of the questions that we're asking. There'll be some bar charts that kind of explain this further. But you know, some of these questions speak to rape myths. You know, and myths around gender violence in general. You know, some attitudes questions. Someone who stays in an abusive relationship is partially responsible for their abuses. Women who wear tight or revealing clothing. You know, those types of questions. We also asked them some questions about the kind of self-efficacy and bystander. Do they feel like they have an understanding of this program? Do they feel as if they can integrate this model into their work? Do they feel as if they have the space to be able to do that? And what we found is that in a positive way, you know, there's some, you know, significant changes from where they came in and where they went out in terms of pre and post. But what we also have seen time and time again is some general patterns here that, you know, 5-point scale, strongly agree, 1 equals strongly agree, 5 equals, 1 equals strongly disagree, 5 equals strongly agree, that there are some differences there that you see that within secondary schools, they are buying more into this. And these are, question? And then the purple is the pre-score, and then the gold bar is the post-score. So our secondary schools, you know, they're coming in, buying into this a little bit more than our community partners and less so than our college partners. You see a similar pattern in terms of, you know, some of the other questions that speak to rape myths. Yeah. Right, yes. You know, as Alan's sharing, our secondary school folks are buying more into this, and these are the folks that are in front of our school, front of our students day in, day out. Yep. Yeah, these are, the secondary schools are counselors, teachers that have been invited to the workshop, people that have an interest in people that are attending this workshop and having an interest in learning more about this and the possibility of integrating this into their curriculum, this is the attitudes that they are having as they're walking into this program. So, as that.
To contrast, to interrupt, but to contrast, our college partners, they're less likely to buy into this. Well, think about what they've been doing the last 5 years, right? I would assume that the college folks would have been where our secondary folks were 5-10 years ago. That's my hypothesis, right? But colleges are a little bit more in tune to this thinking about victim blaming.
Right. And again, you see, some similar patterns here, not as pronounced with the others. This was an interesting one in that when a person resists sex, they often really want it and just need to be talked into it. When we look at secondary schools and colleges and our community partners were a little bit higher than everybody else, which was kind of surprising for us. So part of what this shows is that when we bring people together, they're not at the same point, even though they are having an interest in this area. And I think as preventionists and folks that are wanting to work with the school systems, this is an important point to understand. We also looked at, their feelings of efficacy in being able to implement bystander and step up as a bystander. We see, afterwards, thankfully, that they're feeling more positive than this. But again, our secondary schools folks are not feeling as confident in being able to do this as they kind of step into the door. Our college folks a little bit more, but our community folks, are because we're assuming because they're grappling with this and having an understanding of this maybe at a different level, they're feeling a little bit more comfortable starting in. But everybody's, as they're leaving, is feeling more comfortable with this and feeling more empowered to integrate this into their work setting. One of the challenges is, the flexibility and having that platform to integrate this into the work. And one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about later is some of the benefit of being able to kind of use this type of model in the secondary schools where we really are trying to empower younger people to step up and be a voice against violence. And again, we see, some differences. So, when we're working with secondary schools, we have interest in folks, but we are at a different point in working, and that's where having conversations, the cross-disciplinary type of work that you guys can bring to the table really is important and is needed. So, as I shared in the beginning, some of the quotes are up that we responded to was from a project an ongoing project that I do with my students. Right now, we've got feedback from about 110 different schools that the students have represented. So, this is an inquiry, having them to look at, okay, when we think about the spectrum of prevention in a multi-systemic way of looking at sexual violence from, strengthening knowledge and skills, helping young people to understand about gender violence, sexual violence, to educating professionals, educating teachers about sexual violence, gender-based violence, to changing and looking at policies that we may have in our school, to moving up this spectrum. What's happening in your school? Let's move beyond just thinking about the class presentation. So, using this platform and some, as Alan shared in the beginning, what we've done with this tool is to adapt it to conversations with school systems, and that the framework, the tool that we've created is available to you online, or if you can't access it, we're happy to share with you. It's a way for preventionists to have conversations with school personnel and kind of looking at these multiple levels.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.